Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything that we talk about is aimed at helping you to lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in anxious times. I'm Bridgette, your co-host, and today I'm joined, as always, by my co-host and collaborator, Irvin Nugent. Irvin, say hello to folks and tell them how you're doing.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. Yeah, I am doing wonderful today. End of January as we record this, beginning of February, and things have started out fast for this year. So I am balancing a few balls and just about to go on a trip tomorrow for some work in San Diego. So all steam ahead. So Bridgette, I'm kind of excited about today's topic. Why don't you introduce it?
Yeah, today's topic is all about reframing. And, this came out of, I believe, cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's a therapeutic tool, but I have found that it's also a very potent leadership tool. I know as coaches, we get trained in reframing. I remember learning about this many years ago. But the reason that it recently came to my attention as like a topic I'd love to explore with you is that I had my house painted, the interior, the entire first floor, and including my kitchen. And, you got to take all the artwork down off of the walls and move the furniture. It was kind of a hassle. I put artwork back up mostly where it belonged, except I did make a few changes. And there was a painting in my kitchen, or there is, that I thought, this frame, it's time to change this frame. I love this painting, but I was never crazy about the frame. So I decided to put a different one on it. And I liked it. And I put it right back up on the wall where it was, exact spot. Nothing else changed. And several people who came over to my house and have been to my house many, many times said, "Oh, I love that new painting you have. Where'd you get that?" And I'd scratch my head and I'd be like, that thing has been there for 15 years and you've seen it for 15 years. And they were really surprised. And of course, why did they say that? Well, apparently this new frame made certain things about this painting pop. It brought out certain factors of it that weren't really noticeable before, I guess. And it just really overall created something different. And I thought, wow, isn't that so interesting? It's like I got a new painting, even though I just changed the frame. So, you're a creative type, Irvin, and I'm curious if you've ever had a similar experience, or what do you think of that?
Yeah, totally. I am married. Of course, my husband, Fred, is an avid photographer. And it's funny you say this. There are two little closets in the house. And if you open the closet, it is jam-packed with picture frames, both of them. So it's exactly the same thing, when you play around with the color of the frame, the color of the mat, it is really crazy how it changes the perspective, how it changes, what pops out. And just the difference, I can remember there was a beautiful piece of artwork we got from a friend of ours in LA, and it was kind of done like in a paper parchment, and it was beautiful. Yeah. And we decided to splurge a little bit and get it really professionally framed. And that thing came back, and I swear it looks like $1 million now. Wow. Because it just really helps you focus on it. It looks beautiful. And so, nothing changed with the picture, and yet it's just so inviting now.
That is really cool. I love that, because here what we see is a principle that works in leadership, in coaching, but equally applies in the physical world with how we frame our photos and our artwork. Yeah. And so let's apply to leadership now, right? Let's take that context. And how does reframing work? Well, really very similarly. The context is the frame that a leader or a team is essentially putting around a situation, a challenge, a decision, an opportunity, a conflict. And however they are framing that determines their point of view. Mm-hmm. What they see as possible, what they pay attention to, what they notice about it or don't notice about it. And then, just like we were talking about in our examples, when that frame is shifted in some way and somebody chooses to look at it from a different lens, the meaning of the situation, the interpretation of the situation shifts. And with it often comes a shift in our thinking and in our response to that situation. And so the beauty and the impact of reframing, I think, is that it helps us see new possibilities that were previously hidden to us by the frame we had around it. And then when that happens, it creates new avenues for action.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. So, Irvin, I'm curious, like, I remember when I first got introduced to this concept many, many years ago as a coach. How about you?
So it's interesting. I think as a tool, it was in coaching school that I named it as a process. And yet I think I was doing it before I was able to name it. In leadership as well, sometimes, problems would come up. I remember being on retreat, a leadership retreat, and we watched this video on appreciative inquiry. The whole thing about appreciative inquiry is like looking something, instead of like what's going wrong, what's right, which is a reframe.
It is a reframe.
And I remember that having a huge impact on the team. Like, wow, that's such an interesting way. And just that little, so I think that's the first time I consciously aware of the power of reframe. And then in coaching school was kind of like, oh, this is what we, kind of helping a client do. And very often, it is, we are so down the rabbit hole that we just, a new frame seems impossible. And I think that's the gift. The gift is actually, to like, oh, and just opening up something we didn't see.
Yeah, I like how you said we're so far down the rabbit hole. I think that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
So we don't even see that we have a frame around it. We just see it as, well, that's the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe Bridgette, kind of let's explore that a little bit more. Like how does reframing actually work?
Yeah, because to your point, I think, we all kind of know how to do this. And our listeners are probably saying, yeah, I've done that, for myself or my team before. But how can we become more consciously competent at it? That's what we're after, right? So there's three simple steps, right? First is you just identify a situation or a circumstance or a problem that you're up against that maybe has you a little bit stymied or stuck or anxious, frustrated, and you've gone down that rabbit hole many times with that problem. That's the first step. That's easy enough. The second step is, and this is a little bit more challenging, step back a little bit and see if you can identify the frame that you have put around it. In other words, you got to ask yourself a few questions here, right? So what is the interpretation that I'm bringing to this situation? How am I choosing to look at it? What am I paying the most attention to? And here's a really great question to get at your frame. How do you talk about this situation? Not just to other people, but to yourself. Because that language reveals the frame that you have around it, right? And then you just notice, well, okay, well, if that's how I'm framing it, the last question to ask yourself is this helping me to move forward? Is it an empowering way to view this situation? Or is it keeping me stuck in a rut?
Yeah.
And if the answer to that is the latter part, yes, then step 3 is, okay, play around with reframing.
Yeah.
And the emphasis here, right, is on play around. And the question is, okay, well, that's how I'm looking at it, but what's another way to look at this situation that's also valid, that could also fit?
Yeah.
But that might be more empowering. Now, I think it's really important, Irvin, that it's got to be another way of framing it that fits. It can't just be pie in the sky. Anything fits, Pollyannish, optimistic, like, oh, I could just say this. And if it doesn't have grounding, that doesn't work. Because just like with my piece of artwork, I remember I think it was a 10 by 10. And if I had chosen a frame that was like 20 by 20, people would be like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
So you got to play around with different ways of looking at it that are equally or perhaps even more so valid for the challenge that you're up against. And then notice which of those frames pulls you forward, moves you into a new point of view and a new course of action. So that's a, simple but not easy kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need a little help. But Irvin, what does it bring up for you?
Yeah. One of the things that bring it up for me is, is a little neuroscience tidbit. the reality is, as human beings, we tend to have a negativity bias, and we have it for a very, very good reason. And of course, that's our old friend survival. When we have different experiences in life, sometimes they are negative and positive. And in other words, if we're able to remember the negative ones, we can keep ourselves safe. It's a survival mechanism. And so if we've been in a harmful or a dangerous situation, note to self, don't do that again. Let's keep ourselves safe. And so our brain is kind of wired a little bit like that. It's to use an analogy, kind of positivity is a little like Teflon. It just rinses off. But negativity is a little like Velcro. It sticks. And this is great for survival. However, it also can potentially drag us down the negativity. And I think at times we don't pay enough attention to the positivity. And so I think reframing is a wonderful tool for kind of balancing this out. Are we really just looking at the negative, the safe side? And have we really opened ourselves to different possibility?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, Bridgette, then when you think about this, does any leader come to mind as an example that was able to reframe, as you say, a challenge that really moved them or their team?
I'm going to pick one that's about shifting his team's frame and approach because it was so powerful and I got to witness it firsthand. And this was back during the Great Recession. Gosh, remember that time, Irvin?
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
Peak time.
Yeah.
2007 to 2009-ish or 10. And a lot of businesses were hit really hard. And this client led a business, a small business, and their industry was going to get hit pretty badly by the Great Recession. I remember the day that he reframed things for his team because I happened to be on site and I attended his executive team meeting where he and I had talked before the meeting and strategized on his approach. And he had shared with me, he was aware this team was reeling. He was going to change the way they were looking at it. We go into the meeting room and he and I are sitting there and the team files in. And man, it was like a bunch of deer caught in the headlights. They looked dejected. The tenor and tone was very serious. Nobody was smiling. The mood, the palpable anxiety, it was like I was breathing it in, and they all sat down and one can understand. I mean, I remember the Great Recession and, some of my work got hit badly. And so it was tough times. But what he did is that he acknowledged their anxiety and the challenges ahead. But he framed it like this. He said, first of all, I'm going to share an article with you. He told the team and he passed it out. He said that in this article, what you will see when you read it is some good news, which is that when a crisis hits like this, you're right. Some businesses are going to go out of business, but the ones who don't have some really amazing advantages. And these are the very things we have. And he said they have great systems, they have great processes, and they have fabulous cultures. And they add tremendous value to their clients. So they can withstand something like this if they stay focused on their work and pull together to continue to provide exemplary service and value.
Yeah.
What does happen is other businesses around them that didn't have this strong foundation they don't do as well. They go out of business, and then we're going to be poised to pick up their clients.
Yeah.
He said, now, this isn't going to happen magically. We have to do our part. But he changed the frame from, oh, crap, we're going down, to hang in there and stay focused. The future is actually really bright.
Yeah. Yeah. Love that.
It took about an hour and a half. And when they walked out like different people than how they walked in. There was an upright quality to them. There was some laughter, and I thought, wow. Now, again, his reframing was grounded. It was not Pollyannish.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, he did change fundamentally the frame they had around this crisis. And they are alive and doing terrifically well today. So that's what came to mind.
Love that.
Yeah. So I don't know. What do you think, Irvin?
One of the things that comes to mind is whenever a behavior is reframed and how that can help us shift our thinking about that. The person that comes to mind for me is Ed Friedman. And you may have heard that name before. You'll know that a lot of our thinking is grounded on resilient leadership, which really comes from or is connected to the work of Mary Bowen and systems thinking. And Mary Bowen, of course, was primarily concerned with families and how it showed up in families. And what made Ed Friedman really connected with that and a thought leader is that he really was intrigued by that and then applied it to organizations. So how does systems thinking show up in organizations? And one of the things that Ed Friedman really talked about is one of the challenges that many leaders face. And that challenge is resistance to new ideas, resistance to ways of doing things. And sometimes that resistance turns into sabotage. And so as he was thinking about it, what is this? Because very often the way we think about that is I am doing something wrong and people are resisting this. And if only I could change the way I'm doing it, then people would accept the change and we wouldn't have this resistance. And Friedman was saying, well, is that really the case? And what he did was he really said, actually, let's just reframe the way we look at resistance and sabotage. And actually, does it indicate something totally different? And actually, he said, instead of you doing something wrong, it's actually maybe a sign of you doing something right. And instead of fearing it or taking it as a personal defeat, actually, it is something that is just inevitable. It's the way that systems operate. And indeed, in any change initiative or any way when you're bringing something new, this is something that will happen. And we need to expect it. And so just think how freeing that is for a leader. I mean, I've had many situations of leaders who've really been beating themselves up thinking, if only I'd done something different, if I'd done this or I'd done that. And really, it's part of the job. And it's part of the natural flow of things. And therefore, how freeing that is. This is just something I have to be at peace with that's happening and to know that there will be a life. And ultimately at the end of this moment, people will self-decide. Well, do I want to change or do I want to move? And really often that's what happens. So, I think very often that ability to reframe behavior can be very freeing. Now, if you're fascinated by that, thinking, oh, that's an interesting idea, let me explore that a little bit more. We have actually a full episode on this. It's episode 23. So if you want to explore the reality of sabotage and the reality of resistance, that's the episode to go to. So Bridgette, anything else that comes to mind when you think about this topic of reframing?
Yeah, I think I want to share one more example that is about another client. But this one's different because what he did was reframe a struggle for himself. So it didn't involve his team. It really was about reframing something that was very personal and weighed very heavily on him. And so here was the situation. So this is a leader that I coached a couple of years ago who was very successful, worked in a very tough industry, led a big office in his organization, and despite being successful, had this lifelong struggle with ADHD. And for him, what that meant is that being like time management, staying focused, being well organized, putting systems and processes in place, those were things that maybe, I don't know, for you, Irvin, are easy, but for my client, no, it was a daily struggle. They would get going on something and something would distract them. They go down a rabbit hole and 2 hours later, it's like, whoa, where did my time go? The thing about this is even though they had succeeded despite this, there was an inner dialogue that was pretty brutal. And it was a way of framing this that went something like this. I suck at time management and I'm never going to get good at it. And that makes me an imposter. I should be good at it. My peers are good at it. And I think the way of framing it like that created a sense of guilt and just really weighed him down.
Yeah.
We were talking about this and he learned about reframing. And then the next coaching session, he said something really interesting to me. He said, I really took a look at how I was framing my ADHD struggle. And I realized, man, that is keeping you stuck. And I decided that's not how I want to look at it anymore. was like, oh, that's really cool. How are you looking at it? And what he said is, I'm not good at that, but I can get a little bit better, and that's
Yeah.
good enough.
Yeah.
And he goes, it was like a giant weight came off of my shoulders. I can just get a little bit better, and that's good.
Love
And
that.
so he put in place a few small little changes that got him a little bit better, and he decided that would be good enough. I think the interesting insight also about this is that he said to me, Irvin, you spoke about a client, I think in our last episode, who wanted to have a growth mindset, but realized that was a fixed mindset. This person had a growth mindset, and especially with their employees. But in reframing this, he realized he wasn't bringing a growth mindset to his own struggle at all. It was a mindset, right? Yeah.
Love that distinction. Yeah, because often I think we do that. We treat ourselves differently from others. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So, maybe people listening will be like, oh, I'm really good at reframing things for my team, but I'm not very good at doing it for myself, know? So we invite you listeners to figure out, where in your leadership or life could a dose of reframing open up something new for you?
Yeah. Well, Bridgette, this has been such a great discussion. It's kind of, opening new possibilities for self and for others. And, going back to, how do you do this? It's choose a situation you're in, a challenge that you're facing. And then as you explore that, what is the frame around it now? How am I looking at this? And notice just the energy and the emotion as well that goes with that. And then finally, then what new ways, what new frames could I look at this? Is there another way of looking at this? And I think, maybe a challenge to our listeners today is think of 3 challenges, think of 2 challenges, think of 1 challenge even. Is there a way of reframing this situation? So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bridgette. As always, great to have this conversation with you, and look forward to our next conversations. And listeners, until then, have a wonderful week ahead.
Be well, everybody. Bye-bye.